Podcaster Joe Rogan is speaking out on what he says is a cultural shift among the left and the right. Let's watch.
The culture shift between right and left authoritarianism, and now people don't recognize that if you just stop looking at it in terms of red and blue, look at the actions. Whether it's war, suppression of free speech, pharmacological interventions that are mandatory, right. whatever the f*** it is, that used to all be associated with the authoritative right, the authoritarian right. And now those things are being embraced by the left. And I just think it's just an ideology thing. And I think we get confused and we think we're on the right side. We're on the right side. And if it's our side that's saying this, for sure that's the right thing to do. And no one's critically thinking about this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that someone like Joe Rogan is thinking that way. Obviously, with his massive audience, probably there's going to be some disagreement on whether, which side is the actually authoritarian side. But on, the things, I think what has moved Rogan in that direction of thinking of the left rather than the right as the authoritarian side is the things he mentioned. And in particular, I think there's a lot of legitimacy to it on the COVID front and the war front. COVID, I think, speaks for itself from my perspective at least. But it is true that to the extent you can find any opposition to the war in Ukraine, you can really only find it in corners of the right, or vis-a-vis the Republican Party, which actually did make a stink about the funding for Kevin McCarthy's confirmation. So we are seeing a realignment and a shakeup happen. Now, I think, in fairness, probably you, Brianna, would say there's tons of authoritarianism you could identify on the right or in Republican circles, but there is a shift happening.
Yeah, look, I got to say, I think it's really suspicious when you see authoritarianism happening all over the place. Mm-hmm. We live in a corporate duopoly. We have two corporate parties with similar incentives to suppress people's ability to speak, increase the level of surveillance, increase the power of the intelligence state, and say, oh, but only one side is doing it, or you should be really worried about one side versus the other. I completely agree with so many of the criticisms about how COVID was mishandled, and I stand firmly with the anti-war left about the critiques of how America has engaged in the Ukraine-Russia war. And I completely also agree that there are more anti-war voices elected in Congress than there on the right than there are on the left, because the number on the left is like zero. There's no real elected left in the United States of America. All of that is true. At the same time, you have Republican governors banning entire disciplines of study in the state of Florida. You have them promulgating laws, hundreds of laws across the country, aiming to do things like prevent people from dressing the way they want in drag. You can't wear, am I going to be allowed to wear pants in certain parts of America? You have some Republican Congress members talking about a federal abortion ban. You have a publisher, this was a story earlier this week, a publisher removed references to Rosa Parks' race in a draft of a Florida textbook. So they say now that she had to move. Someone asked her to move and she stood her ground, and that's why she's a hero. Why, pray tell that they ask her to move, right? So this is what's going on in the country. And I'm concerned that people are being softened to any authoritarianism anywhere because this kind of team sport aspect is being injected into it. And people think, well, as long as my side is doing it less, I'm not going to have a critique of my own side.
What do you think, Batya?
I mean, whenever Brianna talks, I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's bad, and that's bad, and that's bad. I mean, I think naturally I feel that Joe Rogan is right. I mean, I remember when the right was affiliated with, things like blasphemy, right? You can't say this, you can't say that. And now they're the ones sort of speaking up for free speech, at least on some issues. The banning tends to be around the issue of children. And so I think that that's a sort of sensitive topic and different than saying, we're banning things outright, whereas on the left there is this the same publisher
that's that is sanitizing Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming and all that?
Look, I don't think so. But
sick of all this.
This is a historical. This is one of these school textbooks.
No, what this sounds like to me is somebody who misread the Stop Woke Act, which actually explicitly mandates teaching children about slavery and discrimination. And they were like, oh God, there's idiots at every level of government and every level of right, like somebody overzealously trying to implement something in a
or not overzealous. There are criminal penalties for violating this act. And people, rightly so, are trying to avoid either having to pay a fine or potentially jail time for violating this act. There was another video that went viral earlier this week of a Zoom call between a teacher and a principal, where the teacher in good faith was trying to say, look, I'm about to teach slavery, and I don't know. Tell me, boss, am I allowed to say that slavery was bad? Can I say slavery was bad? And the teacher and the principal was like, I honestly don't know. And so if you honestly don't know, if laws are being promulgated that make you feel like you could violate the law, if you say a certain thing in the classroom and you self-censor as a consequence, how is that not the arm of the state pushing censorship on people in a way that we should be at least as concerned about as some woke Oberlin student shouting down a professor in a classroom?
Well,
yeah, as I've said, I think
things,
it's pretty, they're pretty silly, and I don't really support
But I think
those
there are
laws.
things that both of you would support it being illegal to say to children, right? I mean, it's not like we have no laws about that. We actually do have laws already in place, like about things you can't say to kids.
When
It's just a
someone comes
question
up
of
with
what.
something in a classroom that is genuinely inappropriate, I would love to have a conversation about it. But this is similar to the conversation about wokeness that we were having. Just be specific. If there's a specific instance, call it out. Let's talk about it. But at a certain point, it seems suspicious to not want to talk about the specific issues and hide behind this idea that there's something out there attacking children. At the end of the day, if you can't name it, and if the consequences are we're not allowed to say that Rosa Parks sat on the bus in a white section of a bus because in the country that we live in,
nobody
there was a
asked that.
white section of the bus.
I think to Baccia's point, literally no one is
Robbie,
saying
Robbie,
that.
that's like saying that people just suggested that Twitter.
Is actually very clear about what you can't
wait a minute,
say, and what
Robbie.
you can't say are things that make one race responsible today.
But to
for things that
Baccia's, to Brianna's point, I get to be the middle ground person for once. It's great. I agree with you, Baccia, that that is not what they're being called to do, and if that's the insanity they should be doing. But I agree with you, Brianna, that the fact that it will for fear of taking on liability
Right.
cause
This
some
is
teachers
exactly
not
the
to
Twitter
teach
files.
things.
This is exactly the Twitter files.
Yeah.
That's like saying, well, the FBI didn't come into Twitter guns a-blazing and force them to censor information.
Right.
They just pressured them and leaked stories and told the press, oh, you see what happened in Facebook? Facebook's responsible for 2016. You don't want Twitter to get that heat, do you? That is exactly the kind of soft
So my
censorship that we're
solution
concerned
is
about.
this school should teach whatever it wants, and this school should teach whatever it wants, and this school should teach whatever it wants.
Robbie,
if you and your
that's a
family don't like it,
terrible
you can go to a
solution.
different
There's
school.
a lot of kids who are stuck in the public
these are
schools.
Well,
depending
I
on
would
their
make it, and
address.
I would allocate the funding for
Right,
them
right.
so they
You
could
don't
take it
believe
and
there
go to
should be
any school.
public
I don't think they
schools,
should be mandated to go to the school in which they live.
You have to do
I
that
think
first.
That instead of fighting these politically divisive battles over what exactly every person has to learn in every single school is going to have us at our throats forever, and we should just allow more choice and more options. And that way, if you object to this book, you don't have to have your kid learn
I'm not going to do school choice sympathy today, Robbie, but I think it's worth noting, I think that it's worth calling out censorship. It's worth calling out authoritarianism wherever it rears its head as forcefully as you can. But this is the kind of, I would argue, whitewashing of right authoritarianism you're getting from right-leaning figures. This is Andrew Sullivan, a section that went viral earlier this week from a recent Substack post of his. This is how he describes the right versus left wokeness. He writes, DeSantis may be overreaching on the anti-woke stuff, and he comes off as gruff and stiff with a bully's feet. But in the broader context of a top-down cultural revolution from the woke left, his attempts at pushback are hardly the stuff of fascism. They're almost poignant in their plain unconstitutionality. So many people point out, he describes DeSantis' unconstitutional laws as poignant.
That's hilarious.
Meanwhile, and not top-down, right? The top-down stuff, he's like, don't be concerned about that. That's cute. It's poignant. But the cultural stuff that's happening at colleges with blue-haired liberals and stuff, as annoying as you might think it might be, he's framing that as the real problem in America. And I'm just afraid we're going to wake up one day and have our real rights and laws stripped because we were complaining too much about what happened at Berkeley.
You don't accept that there is a huge difference between what happens between consenting adults and then what happens in a controlled environment for children that the government already controls what happens.
Tell me the thing that you think the government should address, and we can have a conversation about it. But I'm not going to engage in abstract, what about the childrenism, when we're talking about what we really are happening with the children, is that children are being denied the opportunity to learn about someone I was taught was the civil rights hero growing up, Rosa Parks, because there's active censorship happening in the state of Florida.
I am getting flashbacks. I have not felt myself in the middle position on this show since hearkening all the way back to the Ryan Grimm and Kim Iverson days, which I had to moderate their battles. This is amazing. Thank you for this stroll down memory lane. It's been wonderful having you here today in studio with us, Baccia. Tomorrow on Rising, Bree and I will be back with another stellar show for you. Status Quo News will join us for an update on East Palestine. Baccia, it was so great having you. Thank you so much for making the trek.
It's such a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll be sure to like, share, and subscribe. You know you can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts, so don't miss any of this content. You can also find us on Roku and other streaming devices, so check us out.
And tell us in the comments what you think of our new setup, our cool purple lighting. We're pretty happy about it. We like the music, too. This is a jam.
Yeah, it's nice. It's feeling really good, really crisp.
See you tomorrow, guys.
Bye-bye.